Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The forgotten tortured Tudor woman of the Tower of London. It is believed that Anne Askew was the only woman in recorded history tortured inside the Tower of London during the Tudor period. On the rack, the horrific device that would leave victims with horrific injuries, Anne Askew was brutalised by two men who wanted to extract a confession from her. Anne was later executed by being burned at the stake for being a heretic. However, there was actually one more woman who it's believed was tortured for a confession at the Tower of London. This would mean that Anne Askew was not alone and that the history books need to be rewritten slightly. But who is this woman, and what did she do that was so illegal that she needed to be tortured inside of the infamous Tudor prison, where two of Henry VIII's wives lost their heads? Margaret was born around 1500, and many believe that she was the illegitimate daughter of Edward Stafford, the 3rd Duke of Buckingham. He later would be executed for treason against Henry VIII, but as a young lady she married William Sheeny, and she later, following his death, became the mistress of John Bulmer. Bulmer was a well-off landowner in Yorkshire, and following the death of his wife, the couple then lived together near to Pickering. It's believed in around 1534 the pair were married, and Margaret was then known as Lady Bulmer, and she was considered a very beautiful young woman. However, at this time in history, Henry VIII was beginning to invoke his brutal policy against many of the religious houses in England. The dissolution of the monasteries were brought about following the King's declaration that he was the supreme head of the Church of England, and he turned his back on the Pope and Rome. The dissolutions were one of the largest land grabs in history, with the king shutting down monasteries, abbeys, nunneries, and many more buildings. With this, the monks and nuns lost their way of life, and many were made homeless and were made very poor. Those who did not abide by the king's rules often were subjected to execution. Some of the abbots of many of the abbeys were hanged, drawn and quartered because of this, with very quiet and pious men brutally slain in front of huge crowds. But on the 28th of September 1536, the king's commissioners arrived at Hexham Abbey to kick out the monks and take possession of the religious houses. The monks locked themselves in and barricaded themselves in, and a monk appeared on the roof dressed in armour. He said that the 20 monks inside were armed with cannons and guns and would die before the commissioners should ever take it. But following this, a large rebellion broke out in Yorkshire known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. This was led by a lawyer, Robert Askew, and around 40,000 rebels protesting against Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell, and the dissolution of the monasteries occupied York, and forced the king's forces back. They were also very unhappy with the rising taxes and food prices, and the people of England were very angry. John Bulmer, Margaret Sheeny's husband, joined the rebellion, but he claimed he was forced to do so, as rebels would have burnt his house down if not. But he soon became known as one of the leaders, and Bulmer was involved in the negotiations with Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk. It's believed that there was no evidence that Margaret Sheeny was a member of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and that she was very heavily pregnant at the time of the uprising. She did give birth to a boy named John in the January of 1936, but Robert Askew tried to get the terms that the rebels wanted, but it was clear this would not happen. Because of this, another rebellion broke out in the East Riding of Yorkshire, known as Bigot's Rebellion. This was led by Sir Francis Bigot, who accused Robert Askew of betraying the Pilgrimage of Grace. However, Bigot's rebellion was quickly defeated, and Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk's army, managed to defeat the rebels. But many of the leaders of this, as well as the Pilgrimage of Grace, were then arrested. John Bulmer and Margaret Sheeny were living at home when they heard about the arrest of Robert Askew, and Bulmer stated that he would rather die in a battle with royalists than if he went to London as a prisoner. He debated with Margaret, heading to Scotland, but Bulmer stated that if the pair left the country, then Margaret would leave him. It was said that others heard him say that he would rather be put on the rack than be parted from his wife. For her part, she vowed that she would rather be torn to pieces than go to London, and she begged him to get a ship that would take them and their 3-month-old son to the safety of Scotland. The English government later said that Margaret suggested her husband should start another uprising. It was said that she enticed Sir John Bulmer to rise the commoners again, and that Margaret counselled him to flee the realm if the commoners would not rise, then that he and she should be parted. John Bulmer and Margaret Sheeny were then arrested in April of 1537, and they were then taken to London. Inside the Tower of London, the pair were imprisoned, and it said that they both were tortured brutally. It is known that John Bulmer did not give over any information from the torture, and instead he pleaded guilty to treason charges in the hope of exonerating Margaret Sheeny. What sort of torture Margaret was subjected to is debated, and there are no records of her being put on the rack, but she could have been put on the manacles and suspended in the air. At the time, women were not subjected to torture, and it was deemed inappropriate to do so. It was during Henry VIII's reign that Anne Askew was racked brutally, in which she was nearly killed by the ordeal. Extracting information from rebels was deemed a necessary reason to use torture, and it is probably with this that Margaret was tortured. As mentioned, her torture is not entirely recorded as to what she was forced to, but ultimately she was seen as part of the power couple of the dangerous rebels alongside her husband. However, despite this, Margaret Sheeny was sentenced to death and was to be burned at the stake in horrific fashion in Smithfield. Burning at the stake was a punishment for women found guilty of treason, and many of her supporters said that she committed no overt act of treason. Her offences were merely words and silence. Her execution, was intended as an example to others. There can be no doubt that many women were ardent supporters of the pilgrimage. Lady Bulmer's execution was an object lesson to husbands to teach them to distrust their wives. This did little to appease the king's will, and on the 25th of May 1537, inside of Henry VIII's kingdom at Smithfield, she was brought to the stake. She was tied to it in front of a huge crowd on market day, and then the fire was lit. Margaret Sheeny would have screamed and cried as the flames rose, but she was killed for her involvement alongside her husband in rebellious activities in the north of England. It was said that Margaret Sheeny, other wife of Bulmer, was drawn after them from the Tower of London into Smithfield, and there burnt, according to her judgment, God pardon her soul, being the Friday in Whitsun week. She was a very fair creature and a beautiful. It was also said that, although she did not admit to acting or speaking against the king or his government whilst she was being investigated and examined, she still pleaded guilty to the charge. Her sentence, burning at the stake, was the prescribed method of execution for any woman convicted of high treason. Even so, it was not the usual sentence carried out on those who were found guilty. Just a few months earlier, in an act of relative mercy, Anne Boleyn had been beheaded after her conviction for the same crime. Margaret Sheeny's execution followed several others on that Friday. Earlier in the day, 6 prisoners also judged guilty of high treason had suffered public execution at Tyburn. Sir Stephen Hamerton and Sir John Bulmer, enjoying the privilege of knighthood, had been hanged and beheaded. But inside the Tower of London, it's believed that Margaret Sheeny may have been a forgotten victim of the torture there. It's likely that this was never recorded or written, and she certainly would have had a large amount of interrogation there regarding her activities in rebellions. She could have fled to Scotland if authorities were not on her back, but alongside Anne Askew, she could have been subjected to torture inside one of Tudor England's most brutal prisons. It's unlikely she was racked, but almost certainly would have been subject to lesser tortures, such as the thumbscrews and manacles. With this, Margaret Sheeny would be the forgotten victim of torture of the Tower of London. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.